So there was this period in Earth's history where the entire ocean floor was just covered in slime, like actually covered in this thick bacterial goo. And somehow this was a perfectly functioning ecosystem. For about 100 million years, life looked at this carpet of bacteria and said, yeah, let's build everything on top of this. The creatures living in it looked like nothing alive today. There was flat pancake things, weird fronds, stuff with three-way symmetry, and then it all just collapsed. This is the story of the rise and the fall of the age of slime. Look, we're going back 635 million years. Earth had just finished being completely frozen, and I don't just mean it was cold, I mean the entire planet was ice. Oceans frozen solid, glaciers covering everything. They call this Snowball Earth, which sounds cute, but it was objectively the worst thing that ever happened. Most life just died. The stuff that survived was hiding in tiny pockets near volcanic vents or deep in the ocean where things weren't completely frozen. But around 635 billion years ago, something changed. The ice started melting. The glaciers pulled back and suddenly you had oceans again. The end of this freeze is marked in rocks by something called cap carbonates, which is just a fancy way of saying there's this weird layer of limestone that forms when glaciers melt super fast. Geologists love this stuff because it shows up everywhere at the same time, which means the melting was global. So now you've got a planet that went from frozen wasteland to tropical nightmare in what's probably a pretty short time span. The climate swung hard in the other direction. No more ice meant the sun could actually heat things up again, so temperatures rose. Rain started falling on land that hadn't seen rain in millions of years, and the oceans filled back up with water that could support life. But here's where it gets interesting. The oceans weren't just wet again. They were different. The chemistry had changed. Oxygen started building up in the water in amounts Earth had never seen before. Before this, the ocean had some oxygen near the surface where bacteria were doing photosynthesis, but the deep water was basically dead. There was no oxygen down there at all, but after the thaw, oxygen started spreading. More of it deeper down everywhere. Scientists can track this because of something called the Cambrian Explosion, which is the most dramatic chemical shift in Earth's entire history. The carbon isotopes in rocks from this time go completely haywire. The short version is that a massive amount of organic material in the ocean got oxidized. Basically, all of this dead stuff reacted with oxygen and got broken down. This tells us oxygen levels were spiking hard, and oxygen matters because it is fuel. You need oxygen to build big bodies and actually move around and do things. Without it, life stays small and boring. So you've got warming oceans, oxygen flooding in, and on top of that, the continents were moving around. The old supercontinent, Rodinia, was breaking apart. Chunks of land were drifting away from each other. This created more coastlines and shallow seas, which are perfect spots for life to thrive. Eventually, these pieces would come back together into a new supercontinent called Gondwana, but that took a while. For now, things were spreading out. And then, because Earth can't just let things be nice, a giant meteor hit. Around 580 million years ago, something slammed into what's now South Australia and left a crater over 30 kilometers wide. The Acriman impact. The blast would have been huge. Tsunamis, fires, debris in the atmosphere blocking sunlight. Locally, it was a disaster. Globally, it might have even triggered a brief cold snap, but life kept going. It had survived worse, and life always finds a way. By this point, the stage was set. You had warm oceans, lots of oxygen, and shallow seas along coastlines, an environment that was finally stable enough for life to try something new. For billions of years before this, life had been mostly microscopic. It was single cells floating around, and occasionally some cells would clump together into little films or mats, but nothing you could see without a microscope. But now conditions were perfect for something bigger, and what happened next wasn't some dramatic explosion of fish or reptiles or anything that we would ever recognize. What happened was bacteria. Just an absurdly stupid amount of bacteria covering everything, which brings us to the name Age of Slime. The stuff covering the seafloor wasn't just random gunk. It was organized. These were microbial mats, which are basically sheets of bacteria and algae all stuck together. They form when microbes grow on a surface and then secrete this sticky slime that glues them into a carpet. If you've ever walked on a muddy beach and felt that slippery film under your feet, that's a microbial mat. It's a small scale, but it's the same idea. In the Ediacaran period, these mats were everywhere, and I mean everywhere. The entire ocean floor and shallow areas was covered. No bare sediment, just this thick bacteria bacterial layers sitting on top of the mud. They'd grow dense and cohesive, sometimes several centimeters thick. The bacteria at the top would photosynthesize during the day, making oxygen, and the ones underneath would digest dead material and organic matter. It was a whole system. We know these mats existed. Now you might be thinking, well, how do we know any of this? This sounds like a lot of science fiction. Well, we know these mats existed because the rocks from this time have these weird textures. Geologists call them elephant skin textures, which is actually a good description for once. The rock surface is wrinkled and bumpy in this very specific pattern that only forms when microbial mats dry out or get buried. You see these textures in Ediacaran rocks from all over the world. Australia, Namibia, Russia, Canada. Everywhere life existed, there were mats. The reason these mats could get so widespread is because nothing was stopping them. In modern oceans, mats get destroyed constantly. Snails scrape them up, worms burrow through them, fish poke around and tear them apart. But in the Ediacaran, none of that existed yet. There were no snails, no worms, and no fish at all. The mats just grew undisturbed. And this created something really important. The sticky slime from the bacteria glued sediment particles together. It made the seafloor firm and stable. Normally, underwater sediment is loose and shifts around with currents. But when you've got a mat holding it down, it stays put. This matters because it meant the seafloor wasn't just mud soup. It was solid ground, so things could sit on it, attach to it, and live on it. The mats also became a food source. They were full of bacteria, which meant nutrients. Lots of organic material was just sitting there waiting to be eaten. And since the mats were everywhere, food was everywhere. You didn't have to hunt or search. You just existed on top of this buffet. But here's the other thing mats did. And this is actually the main reason we know so much about Ediacaran life. They preserved things. When something died on a microbial mat, the bacteria would keep growing and kind of seal over it. The slime would fill in the details of the body. Then, if the sediment suddenly buried it, which happened during storms, you'd get this perfect impression. The mat would hold the shape while minerals precipitated and turned it into rock. Paleontologists have a term for this. They call it the death mask hypothesis. The idea is that the microbial mat acts as a mold, capturing the outline of dead organisms. Without mats, soft-bodied creatures basically never fossilize. They just rot away. But with mats, you get these detailed impressions showing texture and shape. This is why we have fossils of soft things from the Ediacaran, but almost nowhere else in the rock record. The ocean chemistry helped too. Ediacaran seas had high levels of dissolved silica because nothing was using it. There were no sponges pulling it up to make spicules, no diatoms building shells. So sometimes silica would precipitate rapidly around dead organisms and create these casts. Combined with the mat preservation, it meant even delicate structures could be preserved. So you've got the entire seafloor as a stable, firm, food-covered surface that also happens to preserve whatever lives on it. From a bacterial perspective, this is perfect. They've taken over. They're running the show. The mats are producing oxygen, cycling nutrients, and creating a habitat. They're the foundation of the whole ecosystem. And on top of this foundation, things started evolving. Things that make absolutely no sense. Because the slime didn't care. For millions of years, nothing could touch the mats. They just spread and grew and covered everything without any real competition. The reason for this is weirdly simple. Nothing had evolved yet to fight back. There were no grazers, no burrowers, no animals that could dig through sediment or scrape mats off rocks or tear them apart. The things that would normally keep bacterial mats in check just didn't exist. In modern oceans, microbial mats are honestly rare. They only survive in extreme environments where other life can't go. Super salty lakes, hot springs, the bottom of the ocean. Places too harsh for normal animals. But in the Ediacaran, the whole ocean was an extreme environment by modern standards, just in reverse. It was too empty and too undisturbed. The perfect conditions for mats to take over. The mats had zero natural predators. You couldn't eat them without the right equipment, and most bacteria aren't nutritious unless you can break down their cell walls. And that requires specific digestive enzymes. The early creatures evolving on top of the mats didn't have those enzymes yet. They weren't equipped to eat bacteria directly, so the mats just sat there, untouchable, growing thicker. And because nothing was digging or burrowing, the seafloor stayed layered. There was no mixing. The mats on top, the sediment underneath, and everything in neat horizontal sheets. Geologists have a term for this kind of undisturbed seafloor. They call it a mat ground. Really clever. Before animals started churning sediment, the entire ocean floor was mat ground. It was firm, stable, and completely static. This stability changed everything. It meant organisms could anchor themselves and not worry about sinking into loose mud. The mats provided this solid base that nothing had to engineer or maintain. It was just there. It was free real estate for anything that could attach attach and grow upward. And that's exactly what happened. The early Ediacaran creatures were sessile. That means that they didn't move. They stuck to one spot their whole lives. There were fronds attached to the mat with the holdfast, and they just stood there, filtering water. Discs sat flat on the surface and absorbed nutrients. Nothing was chasing them anyways. The whole ecosystem ran at the speed of bacteria, which, to put it plainly, is very, very slow. Honestly, food chains were ridiculously simple. At the bottom, you had the mats producing organic material through photosynthesis or breaking down the dead stuff. Then you had organisms that either absorbed nutrients from the mats directly, filtering tiny particles from the water, or maybe they even grazed on the bacterial film. That was it. There were no predators hunting prey, no complex food webs, just a bunch of filter feeders and grazers sitting in slime. This sounds boring, and it probably was, but it worked. The system was stable for tens of millions of years, and stable meant life could focus on experimenting with new body plans without worrying about survival. There was no pressure to evolve weapons or armor or speed. Just grow big, spread out, and absorb nutrients. Easy. Imagine if your life could be that easy. You don't have to deal with taxes or politics or any of that sort of stuff. All you have to do is grow big, spread out, and eat some nutrients. Sounds kind of peaceful when you put it that way, doesn't it? Oxygen levels helped too. The rise in oxygen meant organisms could afford to be large. Big bodies need lots of oxygen to function, and the Ediacaran oceans were finally providing enough. Combined with the unlimited food from the mats and zero predation, you had perfect conditions for life to just get weird and big without consequences. Some scientists think the mats also acted as a buffer for waste products. Organisms sitting on mats could dump their metabolic waste, and the bacteria would break it down and recycle it. The mats were a self-cleaning habitat. You literally couldn't ask for a better setup if you were an early multicellular organism trying to figure out how to exist. The mat ecosystem even protected organisms from each other. Since nothing was mobile, there was no competition for space in the traditional sense. You grew where you landed. If you were a frond, you sprouted wherever your spore or seed or whatever landed on the mat. Everything just coexisted in this weirdly passive way. And here's the thing that's easy to miss. The mats weren't just habitat. They were the entire infrastructure of the ecosystem. Remove the mats and everything else collapses. The organisms living on them weren't adapted to loose sediment or rocky surfaces. They were adapted specifically to bacterial film. Their holdfasts stuck to slime. Their feeding strategies relied on mat-produced nutrients. Their preservation in the fossil record depended on mat chemistry. The whole system was built on this one foundation. So when people call the Ediacaran the age of slime, they're not exaggerating. The slime was running the show. It was the ground, the food source, the habitat, and the fossil preservative all at once. And every organism that evolved during this time was shaped by that reality. They were slime creatures whether they liked it or not. But that stability came with a problem that nobody could have saw coming at the time. The stuff that evolved to live on the mats wasn't just weird, it was aggressively weird. These organisms looked like someone drew animals while having never seen an animal before. Nothing had eyes, nothing had mouths that you would even be able to recognize, and some didn't even have a clear front or back. They were just shapes. Dickinsonia is probably the most famous of these things. It looked like a ribbed oval pancake lying flat on the sea floor. Some were tiny, a few centimeters, and other grew over a meter long, which is huge for something with no skeleton or shell. It had these repeating segments running across its body in a quilted pattern, and scientists have argued for decades about what it even was. Plant? Fungus? Alien? Well, turns out it was actually an animal. Researchers found preserved fat molecules in a Dickinsonia fossil, specifically cholesterols that only animals can produce. So we know for sure that it was one of us, evolutionarily speaking. But knowing it was an animal doesn't make it less confusing. It had no head, no obvious organs, and probably moved by expanding and contracting its body to sort of ooze along the mat, grazing on bacteria as it went. Fossils show these oval impressions next to Dickinsonia bodies, which are feeding traces. It would sit on the mat, absorb, or scrape up nutrients, then move to a fresh spot. Repeat forever. Really, I kind of think of it as like a freaky snail. That's probably the best image I can put in your head. Charnia was completely different. This thing looked like a fern or a feather sticking up from the sea floor. It had a central stem with branching structures coming off the sides in a fractal pattern. It could grow over half a meter tall, and it lived anchored to the mat by a disc-shaped holdfast, and it just stood there. No movement, no feeding behavior that anyone can currently identify. The best guess is that it absorbed dissolved nutrients from the water through its surface, which is a terrible way to get food that we know now, but apparently it worked fine for it. Charnia and its relatives are called rangeomorphs, and they make up a huge chunk of early Ediacaran fossils. They're all frond shaped with this weird branching pattern, and they dominated the deep water environments where sunlight couldn't reach. That means they definitely weren't photosynthetic. They were just sitting in the dark, soaking up whatever nutrients drifted by, and somehow this is enough to sustain bodies half a meter long. The efficiency must have been terrible, but again, no predators, so who cares? Cambrian was one of the few things that looked remotely normal. It was shaped like an oval slug or a snail without a shell. It was a few centimeters long, and one end was wider and probably had a mouth with some kind of scraping tongue. We know this because fossils of Cambrian are found next to scratch marks on a matte surface, like something had been scraping back and forth. It was grazing, actively eating the bacterial film. This makes Cambrian one of the first known grazers and probably an early relative to mollusks. It had a clear front and back, left and right. It actually had bilateral symmetry, which most animals today have, but most animals then didn't. So Cambrian was weirdly advanced compared to everything else around it. Then you've got Tribrachium, which decided three-way symmetry was the way to go. It sat on the seafloor as a little disc with three spiral arms coming from the center. Not two, not four, three. Fun fact, but nothing alive today has three-way symmetry. Some scientists think it swirled water along its arms to trap food particles, but nobody really knows. It's just sitting there in the fossil record, being geometrically wrong. Spragina looked like someone tried to draw a worm, but gave up halfway. It was segmented with a distinct head region and a tapered tail. It was a few centimeters long, and early researchers thought it might be related to arthropods because of the segments, but it had no legs or a hard exoskeleton. It probably crawled along the mat searching for food, making it one of the more mobile Ediacaran creatures, which isn't really saying much since everything else was basically furniture. Around the very end of the Ediacaran, things started getting skeletons. Claudina was a tiny tube-building organism that secreted a hard calcium carbonate shell. The tubes were just a few millimeters wide and stacked in a cone-in-cone pattern. Multiple Claudina individuals would cluster together and cement their tubes to each other, forming the first reefs ever built by animals. Before this, there were no reefs, no structures, just flat mats, but Claudina started building upward, creating habitat complexity. And here is the important part. Some Claudina fossils have holes drilled into their shells. These are clean round holes that punch through the tube wall. That's a sign of predation. Something was attacking Claudina, boring into the shell to get at the soft animal inside. And this is the first direct evidence of a predator-prey relationship. Someone evolved the ability to break into shells, and they were using it. This peaceful garden was starting to crack. Namacalathus lived alongside Claudina in these late reefs. It looks like a goblet on a stick, a hollow ball with holes in it, mounted on a thin stalk. What it was doing or how it fed, nobody knows, but it had a skeleton, which is the only reason we know it existed at all. There were probably hundreds of other species that we'll never know about because they didn't get preserved. These were soft-bodied things that lived in the wrong place or died in the wrong conditions. The fossils we have are just the lucky ones that happened to die on a mat right before a sandstorm buried them. The real diversity was probably way higher. And then everything that made this world possible started falling apart. Because around 541 million years ago, everything went wrong at once. The Ediacaran biota had been thriving for nearly 100 million years. The same basic setup, mats on the seafloor, weird creatures living on top of them, no predators, no problems. This could have gone on indefinitely. There was no reason to think it would stop, but it did stop, and when it collapsed, it happened fast enough that the fossil record basically shows a before and after with not much in between. The problem started with innovation. New types of organisms were evolving, and these ones had a different approach to life. They weren't content to sit on the mat and filter feed. They wanted to move, dig, burrow into the sediment, and this seems like a minor change, but it completely destroyed the foundation of the Ediacaran world. Burrowing animals were the worst thing that could have happened to the mats. When something burrows, it mixes sediment. It churns the top layer with the bottom layer. It breaks up that nice, stable, layered structure and turns it into soup. And microbial mats cannot handle that. They need a firm surface to grow. Once the sediment is getting constantly mixed and turned over, the mats can't establish themselves. They get ripped apart. Geologists call this the Cambrian substrate revolution. Before it, the seafloor was mat ground, firm and stable. After it, the seafloor was mixed ground, loose and churned. And this shift happened over just a few million years. By the early Cambrian, you can see in the rock record that sediments are full of burrow tunnels. Worms and worm-shaped things were digging everywhere. The mats were getting shredded. And once the mats were gone, everything that depended on them was in trouble. The fronds needed the mats as an anchor point. Without them, there was nowhere to attach. The disc-shaped grazers needed the mats as food. Without them, there was nothing to eat. The whole ecosystem was built on bacterial slime, and somebody just pulled the rug out. But burrowers weren't the only problem. Grazers were getting better at their jobs too. Early Ediacaran grazers like Cambrian had scraped gently at the mat surface. They didn't destroy it, they just trimmed the top layer. But later grazers were more aggressive. Snail-type creatures with actual rasping tongues evolved, things that could tear into the mat and rip it up rather than gently scraping. Between the burrowers churning from below and grazers attacking from above, the mats didn't stand a chance. And then the predators showed up in numbers. We saw hints of predation at the end of the Ediacaran with those drill holes in Cloudina shells, but in the Cambrian, predation had become the default. Everything was either hunting or being hunted. Soft-bodied organisms that had spent millions of years doing nothing suddenly had to deal with things trying to eat them. The Ediacaran creatures had no defenses. Dickinsonia was just lying there flat on the sea floor. You could walk up and bite it and it couldn't even do anything back to you. Charnia was stuck in a place on a stalk. It was free protein, just standing there. Even the ones with shells like Cloudina were barely protected because their shells were thin and easy to break into, which is why we find them with holes drilled through. Natural selection during the Ediacaran had been weirdly relaxed. There was no pressure to evolve speed or armor or weapons because again, there were no threats. Organisms could focus on growing big and absorbing nutrients efficiently. But as soon as the predators appeared, those priorities flipped. Now you need to either run away, hide, or fight back. And the Ediacaran organisms couldn't do any of those things. They were just sitting ducks. Competition got worse too. Ediacaran life had been spread out and passive. Everyone just existed in their own spot without interfering with neighbors. But Cambrian animals were mobile and aggressive. They would actively push others out of good locations, fight over food, and outcompete slower organisms for resources. The Ediacaran creatures weren't adapted for this kind of environment. They'd been living in a peaceful garden, and suddenly it turned into a war zone. There might have been environmental changes helping things along too. Some data suggests ocean chemistry shifted at the boundary between Ediacaran and Cambrian. Carbon isotopes showed a disturbance in the carbon cycle, which could mean oxygen levels fluctuated or nutrient availability changed. If true, that would have added extra stress on top of the biological pressures, and the end result was a mass die-off. Most of the classic Ediacaran forms just vanished from the fossil record. The fronds disappear, the big flat discs disappear. The quilted mattress creatures disappear. By the early Cambrian, the fossil assemblages just look completely different. Instead of Dickinsonia and Charnia, you've got trilobites and early arthropods and shelly things scrolling around. Some Ediacaran lineages probably did survive by evolving into something unrecognizable. If Cambrian was related to mollusks, then its descendants might have been the Cambrian snails and shellfish, but the distinct body plans of the Ediacaran mostly went extinct. Nature tried that experiment and then moved on. The really bleak part is how fast this all happened. There was 100 million years of stability, and then within maybe 10 million years, the whole system was gone. That is incredibly fast in geological time. It is fast enough that organisms couldn't adapt. They just died out and got replaced by animals that were better suited to the new violent world. Which raises an obvious question. Why does any of this matter? Why are we talking about slime? Well, here's the thing. The Ediacaran period isn't just some obscure chapter in Earth's history that only geologists and people that really care about prehistoric animals care about. It's the origin story for complex life. Everything alive today, including you, traces back to organisms that evolved during or right after the Ediacaran. Before this period, life was bacteria, just single cells floating around for billions of years. The Ediacaran was when multicellular life figured out how to exist at scale, how to build bodies with different tissue types, how to move, how to interact with an environment. All of the basic tools that modern animals use were invented during the Ediacaran. And the weirdness of the Ediacaran organisms shows us something important. Evolution doesn't have a plan. It just tries things. Some of those things work and survive, and others fail and go extinct. The Ediacaran was a period of experimentation when nature tried out body plans that never got repeated. Three-way symmetry, quilted structures, fractal fronds. None of that survived, but it demonstrates how flexible evolution can be when it's operating in open territory. The fact that most Ediacaran creatures went extinct also tells us something. Success isn't permanent. You can dominate an ecosystem for 100 million years and still get wiped out when conditions change. The Ediacaran biota was perfectly adapted to their environment, but that environment was temporary, and as soon as the mats disappeared and predators evolved, they were done. This is important because we're currently living through another period of rapid environmental change. Species that are well adapted to the current world might not survive if things shift too fast. The Ediacaran extinction wasn't caused by an asteroid or a volcanic eruption. It was caused by new organisms changing the rules of the game: competition and predation and ecosystem engineering. And once those changes started, there was no going back. Sound familiar? On a more practical level, studying the Ediacaran helps us understand what early animal evolution looked like. Fossils from this period include some of the first bilaterians, the first shell builders, the first reefs, and the first predators. These are foundational innovations that led directly to the Cambrian Explosion. Without the Ediacaran as a testing ground, the Cambrian might not have been possible. And finally, the preservation of Ediacaran fossils itself is a weird accident. We only know about these creatures because the microbial mats preserved them. Once the mats disappeared, that preservation window closed, and soft-bodied organisms from later periods almost never fossilize. So we have this unique picture of early animal life that we wouldn't have had without all of that slime. The Ediacaran was the age when Earth transitioned from a microbial planet to an animal planet. The slime-covered seafloor was a bridge between those two worlds, and even though that bridge collapsed and most of the creatures living on it went extinct, their legacy is everything alive today. Evolution took the lessons learned in the slime and built the modern biosphere on top of it, which is honestly probably more credit than bacterial goo deserves, but here we are. It's a YouTube video. Anyways, if you enjoyed watching this video and you'd like to see me do more videos like this talking about certain ages of the Earth, make sure to give this video a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on future uploads. Also hit the hype button so that this video can get seen by more people just like you. And if you want to watch another one of my videos right now, you can click the video on the screen.